I'll just say.
Text can be like, my 12 students are painting my ass.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming today. This is the final seminar of our spring seminar series. So expectations for Seth are extremely high. And so let's let him know how disappointed we are as he goes through his talk. When I'm speaking, I always want to set the bar really low. So I'm trying to set it high so Seth has a harder time of hitting that bar. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to William, who is a student in Seth's lab, to introduce our speaker. But thanks again for coming. Thanks for coming to other seminars this semester. It's been a good seminar series. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm William Radecki. I'm a PhD candidate in Seth's Forest Health Lab. So today our presenter, Dr. Seth Davis, will be presenting on bees and flowers they interact with in the Front Range. His lab broadly focuses on plant-insect interactions, pollinator-plant interactions, as well as the impacts of those on forest health, forest ecosystems. He got his bachelor's and master's from Northern Arizona University. And I like this because he also got his PhD from Northern Arizona University in forest science. All three at the same school. I think it's a little weird. And I also think that's probably where he learned to draw these really cool figures on whiteboards. Ask him, and he'll draw a really cool figure on a whiteboard for you. Doesn't matter what it is. And
it matters.
Yeah, it's the figures. It's the figures. And so today's talk, generally he's going to be talking about native bee assemblages and the impacts on those from management in the Front Range, as well as pollination, conservation, the impact on those ecosystems. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Seth Davis.
Thanks, William and Troy. And actually, a bunch of the students here, folks here are students in my class, so I've goaded them here with extra credit already. But so thanks for having me, and I'm glad to share the work we've been doing. It's actually been 8 years, I think, since I gave a departmental seminar here. And the first time it was all about bark beetles, and we still work on bark beetles, the ecology of forest insects, quite a bit. But since that time, a lot of new focus has come into the lab as well, and we work a lot on native bees now too, which has been a really interesting experience. I've learned a lot along the way. I came in very much as like a traditional forest entomologist who focus on insects that attack and damage forest trees. And since then, we've kind of shifted that thinking to start thinking more about like the positive aspects of insects and forest and how we can manage that too. So that's where a lot of this comes from. And so this is going to be a little bit autobiographical, walking through some studies that we've done and just kind of talk about, the empiricism that's led the way with that. So first, I'll just talk about bees and their conservation and why that's important. I think a lot of folks in this room will have a good grasp on that already, but there's some important context there. And then we'll just talk about sort of the autobiography, like how did this happen, who was I working with, and how have we kind of proceeded to learn the native bee assemblages of Colorado. And then what are we doing now? So what's come out of those initial studies, which was about 7 or 8 years of work, and like where are we going with it now? Okay. So I'll start with this simple idea that ecosystem services often rely on some amount of biodiversity. And here's a couple of different examples of where species richness drives key ecosystem services, right? So right here in the top, total community biomass. So like the productivity of an ecosystem generally relies on the number of species that are in it. Drought resistance can be improved as species richness increases. And even the stability of a community can increase with species richness as well. So this is just 3 different ways in which diversity drives ecosystem function. There's a lot of ecosystem processes and ecosystem functions that we care about as land managers, and can use this as a basis to begin thinking about those and addressing them appropriately. So for those of you who were in my class yesterday, you saw some of these slides already, but it won't be too much repeat. This is a story I think that many of us are familiar with now, this idea of the decline of insect populations, the decline of insect biodiversity, quote unquote, the insect apocalypse, right? Who's heard some tell of this story before? Pretty much everyone in the room has caught wind of this. And like I was saying in class yesterday, I believe this is a real pattern, a real trend, and something that should be fundamentally concerning for the preservation of life on Earth in general, because insects represent one of the lowest trophic groups upon which many other ecosystem services and many other trophic networks rely. Right? So really the building blocks and the movers and shakers of ecosystems in very many ways, at least as far as animals are concerned. So that idea first kind of started, to me, what seems still like a relatively recent study, but this is, I think, 7 or 8 years old now. And this study was published in PLOS One that showed, using a series of trapping studies, that over the last 25 years, 27 years, there's been a strong decline in the daily sampled biomass of flying insects. And this is a very strong trend. And you see that decline is just really substantial. And in this figure, each of these gray lines represents an individual trap. So in all but one, this one is a straight line across, in all but one instance, flying insect biomass declines significantly, right? So this kind of shows the point. From a species composition perspective, this is what that might look like. Okay, so this I'm going to show you is a series of photos taken by a famous tropical ecologist, Dan Jansen, documenting moth biodiversity in Costa Rica. So this is a picture of a blacklight trap in 1984. This is what the same trapping study in the same area looked like by 2007. So you can see some change in the sort of diversity and the body size of the animals there. And then by 2019, this represents a little bit longer than that 27-year period shown in the study, but you can see like the moth biodiversity and the moth biomass in this system is totally depauperate at this point, right? And this is in tropical rainforest, so an area that's supposed to have extremely high diversity and high abundance of forest insects. So yikes, that's concerning, right? But I think we have to be concerned also with what kind of ecosystem processes are important for sustaining life on Earth. And for agriculture and human well-being, pollination is a really critical ecosystem service, and it's one that relies fundamentally on the biodiversity of bees. So bees do all kinds of good things for us, right? They maintain genetic diversity in ecological networks. They move around the genetic material of plants. They're food for higher trophic levels, and they fundamentally drive the productivity of plants that produce crops. Many of the crops that we eat, right, are really rely on bees in order to pollinate and be productive. So this is critical concern. And bees, by the way, are flying insects, so they fall under this same purview, insects that are probably in decline. This looks better on my screen than it does up here, but one thing that we should be thankful for is that bees are also an incredibly diverse group. Globally, I think there's an estimated 16,000 species or so, at least they're described. But the hymenopterans in general are some of the very most diverse, biodiverse forms of insects that we have. So there's just this incredible variation in morphology, ecology. They're incredibly beautiful animals and really cool to study. But you can see a trend in, like other flying insects, bee biodiversity changing over time. So in this figure, what you're looking at are basically species detection curves in museum data sets. So you're looking at overall species richness detected relative to the number of specimens that are being cataloged into museums from 1950 to 2010. And you can see that from 1950, 1960, 1970, these are all kind of tracking at the same rate of species detection in these museum catalogs. But by the time we hit 1990, 2000, and 2010, that curve starts to go way down, right? And one of the things that's even more concerning here is we actually have a lot more specimens getting cataloged in these most recent time events, but there's a lot less detection of bee biodiversity. So this is just sort of proof of concept with the other things I just showed you that indeed bee biodiversity is declining. They're very important for pollination services, and this figure shows you that in two different ways. So people, when they think of pollination and agricultural systems, they almost always think of honeybees. But in fact, native bees do a very large amount of that lifting. And so in this figure, what you're looking at is the pollen grains on average carried by a set of honeybees versus native bees. And you can see that even though they both meet this sort of pollination threshold that's required for seed set and fruit production, the native bees carry maybe 2 times as much pollen on their bodies as these honeybees do, as these managed honeybees. When you look at this in terms of economic valuation, which is what this picture is showing you, across several different methods of calculation, for the most part, the value of that service is estimated to be similar to, if not much greater than, the economic value produced by honeybees, right? So not only are they really good at moving pollen around, that service is probably worth more than the service that we get from all these managed apiaries that we have all over the place. And like you all just showed me a minute ago, by raising your hands, there's increasing public interest in this topic, both in the United States and throughout the world. So this is just total coverage, percent coverage on a day-to-day basis since 1980. And you can kind of see when colony collapse disorder was first described and became very hot in the news, and then that kind of went away. But then recently in the US and worldwide, we've seen another big spike in just public interest in this topic of pollinator conservation. So now's the time, I think, for us to really start thinking about like how the things that we're doing on the landscape affect our native bee species. And there's more public interest now than there's ever been. In general, bee biodiversity is the highest in relatively arid ecosystems and even Mediterranean ecosystems. So often folks will think that, well, the tropics are probably where bee biodiversity is really concentrated. But in fact, the highest representation of bee biodiversity comes from these Mediterranean systems, and then these arid desert ecosystems like in Australia and the Western United States. Okay, so we're in luck, actually. As far as studying bees go, we live in a really good place for doing that. And this is a very, very diverse place for bees, probably because we have this really high range of different ecosystem types, a wide range of latitudes, and so on, right? That can support lots of different types of habitats. So bee diversity in Colorado is pretty high. At the time I made this slide, maybe 950 species. I think more recent estimates, I don't know, 1,100 or so is what I've heard recently. So there's a lot of bee biodiversity in Colorado. And you can see that the majority of that detection has been like on the Front Range, where there's a lot of scientists hanging out, sampling insects, and then, you know, a good representation sort of on the western slope. We know very little about the bee biodiversity on the eastern side of the state, but based on, you know, what I sort of know about where they like to live, that's probably a very diverse area also that's just generally represented, because not many people want to go out and study bee ecology at the grasslands. But this 950 species, 1,000 species, represents roughly like 6% of all the bee biodiversity in the world, right here in this state. So, you know, I think as conservationists, we have a real responsibility here as well to maintain the diversity and function of these systems, because we have, as far as bees are concerned, we have a treasure here, right? We have a lot of representation. Okay, so this little figure here is something that I'm going to refer back to a few times, and I'm going to use to guide a couple of questions that we asked. And this was taken from a paper published by Lynn Dix, a famous ecologist, in 2021. And what you're looking at here is the results of an expert assessment, which was a survey of a bunch of different scientists and land managers who work on these insects across all continents. And what they did was basically ask them, which of these factors do you think are likely to have the most importance in affecting native pollinators? And what's your confidence in those different estimates? Like, how well established are they? How much do we know about them? And so big dots mean it's really important, and a dark color means it's pretty well established. Okay, so one thing that pops out at me right away is that across most continents, land cover configuration and land management are generally judged by experts to be the most important and the most well-established factors that impact the biodiversity and ecology of native bee species. So I think for us here in a natural resources college, that's actually good news, because in my mind, this is something we can change, right? This is something we can actually focus on, learn about, and adapt our land management techniques in a way that might be appropriate for conserving these key ecosystem services. So that's what I'm going to focus on initially here. And okay, so I'm going to start talking here now about like, how did I get into all this? And my inspiration to study native bees came from a most unlikely place. So neither Chad nor Wade are here right now. But Chad and Wade approached me very shortly after I started at CSU, I think in about 2016 or 2017. And they had this thing they were working on that they just called the big plot. And the big plot is pretty much what it sounds like. It's this plot of land out by Woodland Park here. I think they actually call it the Pike Forest Dynamics plot. But the long and short of it is that they were out there sampling the hell out of this thing. And they measured like every stick on the ground, every single tree in here, every single forb growing on the ground. And so they approached me, this is about a 20-hectare area, and said, hey man, we got some extra money. Do you want to do some bug stuff on the big plot? And I was like, yes, I do. And so this was serendipitous timing because I had a friend of mine from Idaho who had just completed his PhD in bee ecology. And I was sort of very envious of him because like he had all these beautiful specimens and he caught them in these cool traps. And so I approached this guy, Paul, who's a friend of mine. And I said, hey, Paul, I got $15,000. Do you want to identify some bees if I set up a study? And he said, yes, I do. And so that kind of launched this whole thing where we set up about 35 different sampling areas on this big plot. So over a relatively small land area as far as the study of native bees is concerned. But it was fortuitous because at each of these locations where we sampled, there was like really complete information about the structure of the stand, the fuels on the ground, the floral species present in the area, the openness of the canopy, and so on. So they had this really detailed census data that we could match against our samples of bee diversity. And it resulted in this little paper here that we published 8 years ago now, and has since done pretty well and kind of set the stage for like everything else that we've done. And it was really my introduction into learning about how you sample and describe native bee assemblages. This is a spruce forest. So it's not a terribly diverse system insofar as like insect biodiversity. But one of the things we learned was that there's a great deal of seasonal variation in bee assemblages. Now, of course, anyone who studies plants or insects probably knows that already. But the important reason to bring that up is because if you want to look at total biodiversity in a system, you need to sample it throughout the growing season, because otherwise you end up missing a lot of these key players that are only active or only present at very specific times. So early in the year, for example, like in April and May, we see a real dominance of these like solitary cavity nesting species. By the time we reach June, July, and even August, the community really became dominated by species that develop social colonies, like bumblebees and so on. But this was an important first step. But the thing that was really, really clear that came out of this study was that forest basal area is strongly correlated with bee abundance and diversity. Right? And maybe that's not a surprise. But here in both of these graphs, you're looking at bee abundance in the top graph, Shannon's H prime, the diversity index in the bottom graph, and basal area on the x-axis the same. And so in both of these graphs, you see a strong decline in bee abundance and bee diversity as the basal area of the stand increases. For those of you who aren't familiar with basal area, that's like representative of the cross-sectional area of trees per unit area landscape, and is basically an estimate of forest structure that tells you about how much tree stuff is in that area you're looking at. And so recall, there's a strong importance of land cover and land management on native bees. Well, as foresters, I have 3 degrees in forestry. If you want to improve bee biodiversity, just in the forest, and look, you're going to get an increase of bee abundance and diversity. So this is promising to me because it's something that's like directly manipulable that we as land managers can do something about. But it also got me thinking, well, that was an observational study where we just kind of went out, looked at bee abundances in areas that had high or low basal area. And you begin to wonder, well, what about the things that impact forest structure and reduce basal area, and start thinking about this as like natural experiments? For example, things like bark beetles that can reduce the basal area of a stand, things like fire, which can really change the structure of a system, and even things like anthropogenic disturbances, thinning, biox. And so I was sort of thinking about all the ways in which these different factors can affect bee biodiversity through the reduction of basal area. And I'll just start with my own study first. And so one of the things I did after that first investigation was kind of go out to these areas that had seen a lot of bark beetle outbreak. I was really focusing on spruce beetle, and I wanted to follow up in a similar alpine system. So what you're looking at here is a map that's basically showing you the density of spruce in blue. The bluer it is, the more spruce there is. The gray polygons are showing aerially surveyed locations of spruce beetle mortality. And then the little crosses show the basal area mortality in the locations that I sampled. So we picked all these places across a number of mountain pass areas that spanned a range of basal area mortalities due to spruce beetle, and basically asked the question, do you see some of the same patterns that we saw in that other system? And the hypotheses that I had can kind of be represented in this simple pictograph. You have a small bark beetle population that results in a closed canopy. There should be fewer resources for bees and a more simplistic bee assemblage, versus in a situation where bark beetle populations reach high density, reduce the canopy, and that will eventually result in the recruitment of floral resources to that area, which could impact native bee assemblages. And without showing any more figures, this turned out to be true, right? So in areas where we had a lot of mortality from these spruce beetles, that resulted in an uptick in the biodiversity of flowers and bees in those stands. So, one of the things I like to say is not to anthropomorphize disturbance too much. And right now we're about to have another significant sort of bark beetle outbreak in the Front Range region. One thing I'd like to point out is that they may actually be helping us out in some ways by preserving key elements of the system that we also rely on, right? So cool. What about wildfire? And, wildfire is another sort of pervasive disturbance in the Western North America. And so intern Riley Gellas, who did her master's on this project, and this paper here was the result of the work she did during her master's degree. And she replicated the same sort of thing that I did in the other studies, where basically she went out, established some sites in areas that had been not burned at high severity, or burned at like a low to moderate severity, and then just evaluated effects on stand basal area and the floral richness. And unsurprisingly, when you have a wildfire that's really severe, that results in forest basal area going to near zero. And in these more intermediate disturbances, a significant reduction as compared to like a control stand that hadn't had any wildfire disturbance. And then you see a corresponding increase in the floral resources in those heavily bird habitats. So cool, as one would expect. And then when you go out and you sample the native bee assemblage in those areas, you find the same pattern. Bee abundance goes up and bee richness increases in areas that had a lot of basal area reduction, high severity wildfire. In other words, bees like disturbances and are quite happy to recolonize these bird landscapes relatively quickly and set up shop there because there's a lot of floral resources that are available there within just a couple of years post-fire. Now, this is where things start to take a different turn. So then we brought in Cora Davies, who also did her master's on this project. And Cora was examining the effects of thinning specifically, not thinking about other biotic disturbances, but actually forest thinning and how that affected bee assemblages as well. And this becomes a little bit more important here because she studied CFLRP landscape projects. This stands for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. Folks who work in policy or forest management are pretty familiar with this project. And this resulted directly from legislation in 2009 that sort of catalyzed a bunch of these collaborative restoration projects that occurred between the Forest Service and local stakeholders. And they're set up all over the Western United States, including a very large project area, the Colorado Front Range, that's about 1.5 million acres in total size, right? And so there's a lot of money coming in, and these federal initiatives are altering the habitat to our specifications. And the key question is, like, does this legislation result in conditions that are good for native bees or not? Because this could be a really serious problem if we're like going out thinning and doing all this work systematically, like reducing biodiversity and pollination services across the landscape. So she wanted to study this. And for those of you who sort of know the story of ponderosa pine in the southwestern part of the United States, a century of fire extirpation policies basically led to conditions where stands can grow to be quite dense, single-storied. You know, this is a representation of a high basal area stand, and this results, of course, in the loss of the understory. So they were trying to move stands from this condition to this sort of quote-unquote clumpy groupy condition where you have multiple age classes represented, sort of heterogeneous spacing of different groups and so on, that results in more sunlight hitting the forest floor and a reduction in fire risk. So using that framework, Cora studied stands that were between 3 and I want to say it was between 3 and 10 years post-thin, all thinned to these CFLRP specifications. Now, up until now, in those other studies I showed you, we've been using this thing to sample bees. It's called a blue vein trap. And I'm like, you know, I'm an entomologist. I want to put out a trap and have insects go into it, and then my sample's done and we're good. And that was easy, right? And the blue vein trap is handy dandy because it's really attractive to bees. You can just go hang this thing out on some trees, and then you can come back in a week and pick it up and your bucket's full of bees. You've got a pretty good sample. The downside to that is they're also pretty biased. So they tend to be much more attractive when there are a few floral resources. So you paradoxically will have low floral resources in a sample area, but a really high abundance diversity of bees in the blue vein trap, because they can see this thing from, you know, probably a kilometer away. It reflects in the blue ultraviolet spectrum, and they just go right to it, right? So it's sort of maybe not the best representation. It's useful for passive sampling, but what she also wanted to do here was then begin to compare these different sampling methods, right? Recall I said you might need to sample across a growing season to get a really good representation of biodiversity. But this figure, and as was coming out in the literature at the time, also shows that you need to sample with multiple methods if you want to get a really good representation of the diversity in that system. So not only were the blue vein traps not that effective, I mean, there's some overlap between these three methods, all of which are common methods for sampling bees. But the sweep net outperformed everything, right? We got 34 unique species that weren't captured with other methods, just with the old going out and just like old school sweeping around a net, catching insects and looking. The good thing about the sweep net information and what sort of changed my opinion on how we should sample bees was that the netting also provides plant association data. So I can net a bee off a plant and be like, this species came from this plant. And you can do that 1,000 times, and you start to be able to generate ecological networks from these. So in this figure, and I'll show you a few of these, this is called a bipartite figure. We can have the lower trophic level represented by our different plant species, and the higher trophic level represented by the different bee species we captured. And what's cool about these networks is that they should have a fairly complex structure, but they have properties that allow us to make some inferences about the resilience and robustness of these ecological networks. So like one such property is called nestedness. And this is a condition where specialists with few linkages interact with a subset of species that are also generalists. So in other words, in a structure like this, you have a lot of functional redundancy. And you could lose one or two species from this system, but everybody still gets pollinated, or every bee still gets has sufficient foraging resources. So things like the number of connections, the relative nestedness of the network, and so on, allow us to make some inference about how like resilient the system is and how likely it is to collapse if you start randomly taking species out of it. Because also recall that species randomly are extirpated or go extinct all the time. We just don't know it. So yeah, these nested networks are resilient because there's all this functional redundancy built into the pollination network. Okay, so I'm going to show you now the difference in the ecological network between those unthinned control stands that had a century of sort of fire extirpation and those that were thinned to CFLRP specifications. And you don't even really need any statistics further than this to get an idea of exactly what the thinning did. So over here, you've got your control stands. This is the network of the thin stands. And you can just tell by looking at this without much more discussion that like this network has way more linkages. It's way more nested. There are more separate modules. There are more diversity. There's a lot more going on. All of the ecological literature on these networks would suggest this system is going to be more resilient, at least in terms of if you remove different species. So this is positive, right? I can conclude from this with some relative certainty, feeling pretty good about myself, that the CFLRP treatments, at least in the front range, are probably doing some good for our native bee species. This is a really positive finding. Things started to get interesting for me here because one of the things we also noticed was that things like Cirsium and Carduus and other weeds, these are both noxious weed species, are also more prevalent in these thin stands. So for folks who've seen thinning operations done or have looked around in these stands after thinning, it's not uncommon for that disturbance of the soil and the introduction of all that mechanized equipment and stuff to result in the introduction of non-native species. A lot of times you'll see cheatgrass come in. You'll see woolly mullet come in after a thinning operation. So you get a lot of native species diversity, but you also get this introduction of non-native species that are introduced by the logging equipment. And this could be a problem. It is often something that's like a post-thinning management to eliminate all these non-native species, right, that we accidentally introduced. But it turns out from another piece of work that was done by Cora shortly thereafter, that this was a really important source of pollen. So she was able to go out, collect pollen from all these different floral species that were present in the landscape, and then preparing with her netting data, be able to say, how many interactions does this species support? How rich are those interactions? And what's the protein content of that pollen? In other words, how nutritionally like useful are these plants to bees? And by multiplying all these things together, we're able to kind of create this index of relative pollinator importance. Surprise, surprise, the plant species that had the highest pollinator index value was musk thistle. This is the best plant that supports the most interactions and the most diverse interactions for native bees in a post-thinning landscape. Whoops. So what do you do about that? Because that creates some kind of conservation conflicts. We want to get rid of these things. We want to support the bees. Bees love them. Luckily, there are some other players we can think about, like Heterotheca villosa. I think it's false hairy golden aster was like number 2, is a really, really good bee plant as well. In fact, our top 5 species were bees. So musk thistle being like the best plant for native bees in this area. But Heterotheca villosa, silver lupin, geranium, calochortus were all native species that also scored very high in this index and sort of span a range of bloom periods and phenologies and colorations. So in my opinion, this also gives us some specific post-treatment restoration targets. Right? If we want to buffer the area against pollinator loss, introduce these species in perhaps post-fire seed mixes, or grow this stuff in your yard. This will grow in my yard naturally. Okay. So that was like the introduction. That was a 15-minute primer on about 8 years of work and several different graduate students. And now what? We've learned a lot from that. And so we've kind of moved on. Here we're back to this, land management. But then we have this other thing down here, like invasive species and their impacts on bees. It turns out that experts are not sure how much of a problem this is and generally rate it as sort of maybe a lower issue in terms of effects on native bee species. But we had like, this has all been super empirical, and that we just learned one thing and like followed it down the rabbit hole, one question after another. And I thought, well, why don't we study these thistles and figure out who's coming to thistle? Does thistle need bee pollination? How well do bees pollinate thistle? In other words, are they moving thistles around on the landscape and contributing to its success also? So enter Hannah Carrillo, who's recently started in the lab, and Hannah set up an experiment last summer where she grew a bunch of cirsium in the greenhouse and then found a bunch of wild populations in the field and bagged them in order to introduce pollination deficit. So it allows you to examine like how much do they need pollination if you exclude pollinators from visiting them. She would take these thistles out in the field or with the field populations like at Waverly, would then remove the bags and allow either honeybees to visit, shoo away the native bees, or allow only native bees to visit, shoo away the honeybees, or just allow it to do whatever. And then record these. She sifted through around 32 hours of footage to study 874 visitations, record and analyze those. This was a lot of work, but it resulted in some interesting information. Thanks, Hannah. So this is kind of hot off the press. Like we're in the process, Hannah's in the process of putting all this together. But then she would collect the thistle seed and examine it. And basically, thistles produce viable seed when they get pollinated. They produce more viable seed when they get pollinated. So here is an example on this petri dish of thistles that were pollinated by honeybees. Here is a situation where it was bagged, pollination deficit, didn't receive any visitors. So zoinks, Scoob, honeybees are moving around thistle pollen and doing a good job of like improving their populations, probably helping them produce viable seed. And this is sort of further demonstrated here by the visitation data. So in this figure, you're looking at the total visits by pollinator group relative to a number of different bee genera. The big spike, this was all in the urban landscape, by the way, because we knew where a lot of this cirsium was. Honeybees really, really like to visit Canada thistle. And in fact, we're by far the most common pollinators of it. And as you can see here, they obviously do a pretty decent job of improving the reproductive capacity of that plant. By the way, we did not know before we started this that there are female and male thistle plants. Whoops, found out after the fact. So yeah, they needed pollination. Probably we could have figured that out already. But when we also look at the duration of those visits as taken from that video data, you can see that Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, actually doesn't spend a lot of time on these plants. They kind of check them out, rustle around on a little, we're gone in about 13 seconds on average, the average of 684 visits. But if you look at these other species like Haleus, Lasioglossum, Andrina, they're hanging out on these plants for minutes and like rustling around on them and really snuffling around in there. Like they love these plants. And here's an example that was actually taken by Fora in the field. There's 4 different bees on this plant at one time. So this bumblebee in the back that you might not be able to see. And so they're just all over this stuff. Right? So more to come, I think, from Hannah's work. What she basically found was that, yeah, they definitely like honeybees. They like, and honeybees like them. So this creates another sort of situation. Like, well, you have these non-native species that are being introduced into the landscape, these thistle plants. But then honeybees are also non-native to this region. And they wouldn't survive the winter here if it wasn't for people taking care of them. A hard freeze will kill the colony. So they have to be kind of carefully babied in order to survive the winter in this part of Colorado. So you have these 2 invasive species maybe interacting to create some unique conservation conflicts for our native bee species. Okay, I've got one more study I want to talk about. And it sort of gets at that idea, like what about pollination management? And what role is that pollinator management, specifically honeybees, like what role is that in playing in affecting the foraging of our native bees? Because keep in mind, native bees love this stuff. But if honeybees love it too, that also sets up the potential for competition between them to occur, which could result in less forage for our native bees, even if it's on invasive species. So we wanted to investigate that idea. And I did this with John Mola, who's another faculty member in the department, and Nathan Komai, who at the time was a research associate in the lab and has since moved on to be the insect taxonomist for CNHP. Nathan's really good at IDing bees. So he was great to have on this project. So this is what happens when you ask ChatGPT to make you a picture of native bees and honeybees competing over a flower. And I don't know what kind of like to make them. Anyway, they look bad. But that resulted in this paper that came out just this last year that we're really proud of. Like I actually wrote this one and it was really fun because we got to go deep into network stuff and sort of look at like how honeybees and their presence might actually be rewiring some of these ecological networks, these plant pollinator networks. So like I said, they're not native here, but people have an affinity for honeybees. And I think that some of that results from all this media on colony collapse disorder, like 15 years ago. And they thought, well, if I bring in honeybees to my backyard and I can keep them in these boxes here, and that'll be saving the whales and stuff because now I'm bringing in these honeybees that are being threatened by colony collapse disorder. But in my opinion, honeybees, that's like introducing cattle into a landscape where you want to conserve all of the native like elk and antelope populations, right? You just introduced a competitor. And they're not just the competitor, they're like the Borg. I mean, it's like native bees are small business owners and they're just out there, single moms, like working hard and like trying to damn thing. And honeybees are like Amazon. Like they're gonna put you out of business. And they're such good foragers. Their populations grow so fast and they can harvest somewhere on the order, like a single colony can harvest on the order of like the amount of provisions that like thousands of cavity nesting bees would harvest in a single day. They're really, really effective foragers. So introducing them to the landscape could be problematic. And so actually in 2022, Nathan and I sort of selected all these study sites, about 16 in total in these natural areas in the Fort Collins area. And they varied, they intentionally varied in size, but they also were varied in proximity to the urban landscape. So obviously ones that are interior are going to tend to be smaller, but some are sort of completely urbanized sites. And then others are sort of larger areas that are a little bit further away and have more natural area around them. And so Nathan went out, and over the course of the entire summer, he was sampling bees from flowers and sampling bees from flowers. And he recorded about 1,600 different interactions. And in that sample, honeybees represented about a quarter of all those interactions. That's quite a lot. But when you start to think about how that plays into these pollination networks, you can get an idea of it here. So here, in a site that had a large natural area, a low road density, there's a very low abundance of honeybees. They make up just a small proportion of this ecological network, and they're foraging only on one plant there. And you can see there's all these different groups of interacting bees and flowers in the Bobcat Ridge site. You come interior to the coterie, which is this little dot here. It's pretty much dominated by honeybees, and the structure of this network is also greatly simplified. Now, some of that's because it's a non-natural landscape, right? But when we're able to actually look at like, what happens if you look at road density or just the density of natural areas, and these things aren't completely mutually exclusive because you have other things in here like impervious cover, water surface, stuff like that that can't be used by bees. When we look at the increase in road density, that predicts a positive increase in the number of interactions by honeybees in that ecological network. When you look at the increase in natural area density, that predicts a strong decline in the interaction frequency of honeybees in that ecological network. What does this mean? It means that honeybees are foraging in areas where people are keeping them, in roaded areas, in the urban landscape. So, if you're keeping bees because you have an agricultural operation going on, or you're harvesting honey from them, or whatever, more power to you. If you're keeping them as pets to save the whales, please don't, because that's actually putting a lot of pressure on our native bees. And in fact, when we look at the structure of those networks, right? So I told you things like network nestedness and modularity and so on are good predictors of the ecological resilience of those systems. As we see an increase in the proportion of honeybees in those interaction networks, there's a strong and significant decline in the modularity of those networks as well. And that's potentially concerning because it suggests that honeybees might be able to wire those networks. So we don't know exactly why, but I'll show you some more details in just a minute. I also want to show you the plants that they were foraging on. So this is a little color map. This only shows you a subset of the plants they actually foraged on. But in the top here, you have some of the same players. So the redder, here you've got your bee groups on the bottom. The redder the cell, the more intense the foraging on that particular plant species was. And you got some of the same players, Heterotheca villosa, one of the good guys, Helianthus, our native bees love Helianthus, Grindelia, milkweeds, right? These are all sort of good to have around, and they represent a pretty good smattering of the plants that these native bees really like to forage on. But the bottom panel, these are all weedy species, and these are super abundant, right? Euphorbia esula, I think that's a leafy spurge, right? Convolvulus arvensis, everyone's favorite, the field bindweed. All these bees love all this stuff. Medicago, Melalotus, they're all over these weedy plants. So this creates a bit of a conservation conflict. You want to get rid of weeds in your yard. You want to get rid of weeds in these post-thinning systems. That's going to have probably negative impacts on the foraging of our native bee species. So how do we deal with this? This is a conservation question that's the space we're kind of trying to move into now. The last thing I'll tell you about is this idea of sort of foraging breadth. Those students in my class have listened to some variant of this discussion ad nauseam weeks. But here's one way that it can be applied, and it's important to understand, because I showed you that the modularity of those ecological networks was being reduced, but there was lots of honeybees there. But we don't know why that happens. Well, one possibility is that native bees are changing their foraging preferences or patterns when a lot of honeybees are around. So we're able to take the sample of all the interactions that we recorded for a given bee taxa and say, like, okay, these are all the plants that they visited in the landscape, 5 different species. Then we could go look at an individual site and say, okay, only 4 of those were present at this site that we sampled the network from. And they only actually foraged on 2 of them. So in this instance, I would have assigned the realized foraging breadth in that particular site as 50%, half of the plants that they actually forage on. For 2 of our groups, the incredibly cute plaster bees and Megakylidae, the leafcutter bees, their realized foraging breadth is declining when there's an increase in the frequency of honeybee interactions in these networks. So one way in which these networks are probably being restructured is by actual changes in the behavioral patterns of some of the bees that are there. In other words, plaster bees and leafcutter bees won't forage on plants that are there that are known hosts for them when honeybees are around. Their behaviors are changing. I don't know why this is, and we haven't documented this, we haven't gone down this rabbit hole, but this is the kind of thing that starts to make me think about mechanism, right? We've documented some strong patterns through a series of empirical studies, and now I think we're at a point where we can begin kind of interpreting and testing the mechanisms that drive these changes. Okay, a lot of brain dumping. But anyway, these are kind of the main areas we focused on. Land management, homeowner decisions ultimately affect pollinator habitat. It can result in the introduction non-native plants and non-native bees, which directly affect the foraging preferences and behaviors of the native bees in our ecosystems. We need to think about this more. We care about pollination, critical ecosystem service. That's been established. When we go back to this like broad scale of ecosystem management, in general, it looks like across several different systems and several different types of disturbances, as you reduce the canopy, this generally results in recruitment of floral resources to the story, generally also results in an enhanced biodiversity of bees in that system. But introduction of noxious weeds kind of complicates things because these are great hosts. So for those of you who know me in reference to William's whiteboard comment, I love triangles. So I'm gonna show you a triangle here. We got our native bees, we got our non-native species. And there's some nuance, right? Weeds are forage for wild bees, and they pollinate weeds though. The weeds probably also reduce the biodiversity of native plants. So take that for what it's worth. We haven't really looked at that effect yet. We also have honeybees in the system. Honeybees clearly pollinate weeds and are major visitors to thistle plants. You have invasive species promoting the movement and reproduction of other native invasive species. Honeybees also compete with wild bees. They reduce their foraging breadths, and native bees are changing their behaviors in response to this. You don't really know if wild bees harm honeybees. They probably don't, because honeybees are really good at going long distances to forage. They find these resource-rich sites, they recruit to them, and are quite happy to travel all over the place. Whereas if you're a little teeny native bee, you're not part of Amazon, it's not so easy. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to probably favor native species in post-disturbance landscapes, especially things like Heterotheca and Helianthus, like the stuff we've got. Honeybees change pollination networks. I think they should probably be restricted to urban habitats and not introduced into natural areas. We currently don't have any policy that addresses where somebody can put a honeybee hive right now on our national forest systems, on any of our public lands. But somebody could just decide to come in, drop an apiary there, and do whatever they do. Probably need to be thinking about this from a policy perspective. And this is something, a little teaser that I'm going to leave you with. Another piece of research that was published by Riley, which I won't talk about because I don't think there's time. But if we're going to try to eradicate these non-native forage species, use alcohol-based and polyethoxylated-based surfactants. That's going to greatly reduce non-target effects. Silicon carriers are commonly used in the application of surfactants. They are far more toxic to native bees than alcohol-based surfactants. So that's something you can think about from the ecosystem management perspective. I'll leave it at that. Here's all the folks that kind of did one thing or another, and probably some folks I forgot. We've been getting our funding from NIFA for a while to do this kind of work. And yeah, we've learned a ton. It's been really cool. And I hope we get to keep doing it. So, no.
This was really interesting and read through all about your research. I wanted to ask, in terms of the thistle and other bees you're finding these bees on, do you have any speculation, like, could these be ecological traps? Like, do you suspect there to be any fitness consequences as bees extensively foraging on thistles?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. What I will say is that we do know that they at least provide a lot of protein compared to other plants. So as you probably know, bees require not just protein, but some groups require specific protein to lipid ratios. And so insofar as that dietary requirement, like perhaps, but I haven't thought about that yet. Yeah.
The people who drive around in the spring, and you hire them to pollinate your crops, stuff, they're using honeybees, right?
They're using honeybees.
Does anybody ever talk about using natives for that?
There are some attempts to do that. Folks use like leafcutter bees that can be cultured and released, but you can't keep them like in a hive. They all kind of go off and do their pollination, but then they're gone. But they can be mass reared relatively effectively for that. But a certain bumblebees can too, but they're just not as productive essentially, and you don't get a secondary product from them usually. So the short answer is like yes, but the long answer is it's not as economically viable. Asan, I'll get you second. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the grass restoration we manage space? Thinking about these noxious weeds, like we do have some management options, specifically with chemical control at time of year that we manage. We do spring application, fall application, obviously it depends on species or percent of the trees control it. But is there like a better time of year in terms of the pollinators to do these applications?
Actually, I would go a little further and say one way that this could be controlled is by time of day. Bees are often foraging the most actively early in the morning and at dawn and dusk, and some through midday. But one of the things we found in some of our surfactant-based studies was that after a couple hours, when bees contact a surface that's been like impregnated with surfactants, it doesn't harm them anymore. So if you can apply that stuff either at like midday in the hottest part of the day when nobody wants to be out there working, it'll dry quickly and probably won't cause effects. Or if it can be applied in early nightfall, like after foraging would have ceased, giving it an overnight period to dry, that will probably reduce harm. Yeah. So I would be thinking more about that because bees are active throughout the entire growing season. And obviously you got to hit these things before they go to seed. So yeah, I think time of day is your best bet.
You got to think about like moths.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but that's a possibility. I think if I were just going to guess, it depends a lot on the system, like time of year wise. You get some of the most sensitive, rare species that occur early in the growing season. That's also related to the time to treat the bees. So there's some things to think about for sure.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I don't know anything about bees, so my question might be a little bit dumb. So both honeybees and thistle are non-native to US, right?
Yes.
What if the reason that bees could just spend only 13 seconds. The honeybees spend 13 seconds, and like native bees had to spend more time. Is that they evolved together outside of US, but native bees can't handle the morphology of thistle, so they can't get what they want easily from that flower.
Yeah, that's a good, I mean, that's a possibility. I think that's a decent hypothesis. One thing I will say is when we look at foraging times on like other plant species too, they spend a lot of time on their native plants too, like in the anthus, like sunflower, they'll just swim around in there for a long time. So I think there's also just some differences in like what they're looking for, how long they're willing to spend on actually foraging on a flower surface. Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
maybe building on that a little bit. Maybe it's because they're so nutritionally dense for the honeybees that they don't need to spend as much time on them when when we kind of saw like the protein relationships with other native plants are not as high as it is in the thistle, so they need more time to synthesize what they need from the plant.
Yeah, that could be. And I think a lot about how do bees know what the pollen content is, because adult bees don't eat pollen, but there must be some way for them to determine the quality of the host and evaluate whether or not it meets their dietary requirements. And I don't know that we know much about that. So I think that's interesting. Like that mechanism is something that definitely deserves some consideration.
Okay, let's thank Seth one more time.
Oh,
And the main takeaway is that Seth referenced Scooby-Doo. So, oh, thanks again. Have a good evening.